It's 6:01, so I reckon it's time to kick off. So just to quickly introduce myself, my name's Ale. I am the New South Wales organiser for 350 Australia. Before introducing the other people on the call tonight, I'd just like to start off with an acknowledgement of country. So I would just like to acknowledge that wherever we're joining from tonight across this continent, we're on stolen Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. Tonight, I'm joining from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that acknowledgement to any First Nations people who are with us on the call this evening. I'd also like to acknowledge the leading role that First Nations people have played around the globe in struggles for justice everywhere, and also in resisting the invasion, theft and destruction of the land that sustains all of us. This was and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. And once again, I just encourage everyone to say hi in the chat and post in the chat about which part of the First Nations country you're joining from tonight. And just quickly throw over to Madhu for another acknowledgement as well.
Yeah, so I'm calling in from Wajak Noongar Budja, and I'll be, and so in Boorloo, which is the place otherwise known as Perth, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. Great.
So just a quick introduction of who we're all going to be hearing from tonight. So as mentioned before, my name is Alessandro Moliterno, Ale for short, and I'm the New South Wales organiser for 350 Australia. We've got Madhu also co-hosting with me tonight from the Climate Justice Union WA. We're also going to be hearing from Kabay Tamu, who's a Warraberalgal traditional owner and Torres Strait Islander, Torres Strait 8 claimant. We'll be hearing from Dr. Lesley Hughes from the Climate Council, and we'll be watching a video from Jasmine Kieft, who is a psychologist specialising in the mental health effects of climate change and is a reviewer of the recent report that's just come out. And then we also have some support staff and volunteers on the call tonight. So we've got Surya and Blanche from 350 Sydney. And we've got Luke, Justin and Charlotte from the Climate Justice Union helping out in the chat and on the tech stuff today. And now I'll just throw over to Madhu to give a bit of an overview of what we're going to be covering this evening.
Yeah, so we're going to start with a chance for everyone to introduce themselves and get to know a few of your fellow attendees in a little breakout. Then we're going to hear Kabay about what's happening with the Our Islands, Our Home campaign and all the work that he's been doing with protecting country and with that campaign. And then we'll be hearing from Dr. Lesley Hughes, who will take us through the findings of the latest IPCC report, which deals with the impacts and vulnerabilities of climate change. And then you'll have a chance to have another breakout and kind of process what's happened, have a bit of a chat about what you've heard. And then we'll be coming back to Dr. Hughes to finish up her presentations on sort of what the next steps might be in this moment. And then we'll have a piece from Jasmine, who will talk about some mental health and mental health considerations on, how we process all of this stuff and how we live and care for ourselves and each other as we navigate this crisis. And then after that, we'll have another breakout to, again, acknowledge our responses and just sit with what we've all heard and any feelings that we might have, as is really important when we're doing this work, is to really acknowledge that, we're humans bringing our emotions and experiences and stories to this work. And so just giving some space for that. And then we'll have a bit of a chat about some really concrete actions we can take together before wrapping up. So with that, we're just going to head into breakout rooms now. So if you could just get the slide that goes through what the breakout questions are. So you'll each get 1 minute. And so in your little breakouts, introduce yourself, what's your name, share your pronouns if you're comfortable, where you live, where you're calling from, you know, how long have you been involved in this climate movement, and yeah, what are you looking to get out of today? So those 4 things. And yeah, we should be transporting you into your breakout rooms shortly.
I couldn't see you.
Okay.
Fantastic. All right, cool. So so I'd just like to introduce Kabay. Kabay is a 6th generation Warraberalgal man and traditional owner living on Warraber Island in the Torres Strait. He's one of the claimants from the landmark Torres Strait 8 case, where 8 traditional owners from Torres Strait are taking the Australian government to court in the UN Court of Human Rights over the stance that the government's taken on climate change. And just this month, Kabay and the other Torres Strait Islander traditional owners have released a joint statement with the Climate Council demanding immediate action to protect the Torres Strait from the impacts of climate change. So we'll have a bit more about that joint statement afterwards, but I'll now throw to Kabay, who's going to talk to us about what's going on up there.
Hey, I'm all loud and clear now. Good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yep. Look, first of all, obviously, I'll introduce myself and also give acknowledgement. Kapukut, Ngaunel Kabay, Kulaiki, Ngaigar Minakaima Pasin, Lagau Kuiku Mobaigal, Borgaro Mobaigal, Ngai Goodway Dika, Kaima Baigal. First of all, I'd like to pay my respects to my elders and traditional owners up this way where I'm dialing in from here, and also I'd like to pay my respects to where, you know, everyone else is dialing in from. Pay my respect to the elders and the traditional owners of the land where we all are joining this call from. Well, my name is Kabay Tamu. I'm a Kulkalgal man, Warraberalgal from the Torres Strait Islands. I'm from the central part of the Torres Strait. So for you who don't know where the Torres Strait Island is, it's between the northern tip of Australia, between Cape York and Papua New Guinea. So there's about 17 inhabited islands, and then there's about another 70 odd uninhabited islands. Yeah. So where I'm from, the central part, we have 3 Coral Cay Islands. I'm from Warraber, one of the smallest island, Coral Cay Islands in the Torres Strait. And obviously, you know, this is why we're one of the islands to really push this issue and really try to have a spotlight on this issue up this way in the Torres Strait. Yeah, so right now we are in a situation here where our monsoon has just finished, and usually this is the time now when, you know, but when we go around, we see our land being washed away. Exactly when this monsoon season is over, you go around, you see about 8 to 10 meters of land washed away, and that happens every year. So every year the monsoon comes around with the high tides and the strong winds, obviously creating the big waves, you know, pushes up and you know, erodes our land away and our island. There's communities up here who suffers from coastal erosions, like my island of Warraber, and you go to the top western islands near Papua New Guinea, where there are just mud flats, and those communities, they get inundated by the salt water from the rising sea levels. Yeah, up here, it's not only coastal erosion, but each communities, we suffer from various impacts of climate change. And, that's one of the main reasons why we took the Australian government to court. As you all know, the Torres Strait 8, who launched the case against the Australian federal government for inaction on climate change, and for basically not protecting our human rights, our rights to live, our rights to life here in these islands and in these communities, and our rights to culture, to practice culture, continued culture, ancient culture that has been practiced across these communities in the Torres Strait for thousands of years. And we are at the brink of having to, it's already been talked about, people have been talking about it, to move away from these communities, but it's something that we don't want to do. We never want to do. I think it's something that's really traumatic for a lot of people, especially our elders. When we sit down and we talk to our elders, they say, you can't take a group of people away from their community and relocate them to another place. It would be like colonization happening all over again. You get displaced from your land. You lose your culture and your traditional practices. That's one of the biggest risks that we face every day, and it has a huge impact on us, on us mentally as well. But yeah, so we've been working really closely with 350 in the campaign, Our Islands, Our Home. We've been doing a lot of great work. As was shared before, recently we put out a statement in regards to the IPCC report, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later. But I think the response from the government in terms of when we put our case forward to the UN Human Rights Committee, I think their response has always been that these are impacts and issues that are not happening now. These are things that will happen into the future, and basically saying that, when it comes to that point, then they'll, I don't know, come on board and help us. But what we're saying is, we are the people that are living here on these islands, and we are experiencing a lot of these things, or all of these things every day. We physically see the difference in the natural environment. Things that we predict, or our elders have predicted for many years. It has changed. So many things have changed. But a lot of the response is that it's not happening now. We can't do something that it's not impacting you people, but we're the people, we're living here, we see it, we breathe it. We go to sleep, we wake up every morning, and these are the things that are always on our minds. We allow children get to experience the life that we experienced growing up, the tradition and the cultural practices that have been passed down to us. And it's been practiced here on this land. We can't take our cultural practices and practice it on someone else's land if they have to relocate us. Yeah, but I think, this campaign, it's been really powerful. working closely with 350, myself and all the other claimants. I think we've really done a lot of good work, but it's a long way to go. And I think our stories, with the IPCC report saying that, especially around the low-lying islands and that, saying how vulnerable these communities will be within the next years or so. You've got scientists from all over the world coming together, putting together a report, and yet our government still believes that it won't happen anytime soon. But they acknowledge that it will happen in the future, but they're not taking a step to try and do something to address it today. I think the approach really has to change. But yeah. Anything else you want me to share?
That's fantastic, Kabay. Thank you for sharing that story with us. And yeah, I would just like to thank you for coming and sharing your story with us on behalf of everyone on the call. And it's just truly horrendous to hear the stories of what's happening up there and the inaction that the government is taking and the things that they'll say to try and get out of doing anything about it. But yeah, thank you so much, Kabay. And if you're happy to close off there, then I can talk to people a little bit about what the actions that we can do to support this campaign are.
Yep. Just another quick one. We've had seawalls come up happening. People might hear there's a seawall project going all around not all of the communities, but the four impacted communities. But it doesn't stop there. There's a lot of other communities who are in need as well, and we are the most vulnerable communities right now. That's why we are leading from the front in this fight for the Torres Strait. Yeah. But thanks everyone again for this opportunity to share my story. Thanks.
Thanks, Kabay. And I think if people wanted to use the reaction buttons that you can on Zoom to just share your support there and post in the chat as well. Yeah, thank you so much again, Kabay. And so what we're going to do now is we will be posting in the chat 2 links. So we mentioned earlier that the Torres Strait 8 and Our Islands, Our Home campaign have joined together with the Climate Council in pulling together a joint statement and a list of demands that would be enacted or should be enacted in order to protect the Torres Strait from climate change. There are also measures that relate to a just transition away from a just transition to renewable energy. And full funding for mitigation measures and renewable energy in the Torres Strait. So what we would like people to do is sign up to get that joint statement in front of your MP. So what will happen now is if you look in the chat, you'll be able to see 2 links. And there's one of them for doing an action in person to try and meet your MP in person. And there's also one that would allow you to send an email that contains the joint statement to your local MP. So so what I'd like everyone to do right now is we'll give everyone a minute to just click on those links and sign up. The idea here is basically that we want to try and get this joint statement in front of as many politicians as possible, especially if you live in a seat where climate change is already an issue. But also, I think it's useful for as many MPs and other politicians as possible. So if you don't have a very good MP, you can also try and talk to your senator. So we want them to feel pressure about climate change. We want them to feel pressure to do something about the fact that the Torres Strait Islands are being inundated as sea levels rise. Yeah, so there will also be some local 350 groups around the country who are going to be doing those actions. So for people who would like to do an in-person action, there's a possibility that we can link you up with a group in your local city if there is one at the moment. So what would happen is if you sign up to do the in-person action, then you'll join a list that we will then reach out to, and we'll give everyone a phone call and have a chat with you about trying to organize an action or connect you to another action that's happening already. The other thing that you can do is to click on the email action there now, and you can then finish the email after the session tonight and send that off to your MP as well, and share that link around as well with everyone that you know. If you're in local Facebook groups, climate groups, or email chains or whatever, and just try and get as many people as possible to take that action, because we really want politicians to feel the pressure. We want them to feel the community anger at what's happening, and especially in the lead up to the election, it's a good time to make them worried about their seats. So we're just going to give everyone a minute to finish doing that. I'm just going to stop talking now for a minute and Lee will concentrate, and then we'll come back shortly after that and go on to Lesley's section.
Yeah, thank you. And just wanted to also extend my gratitude and appreciation to Kabay for sharing your story with us. It's a real privilege to hear you. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lesley Hughes, who is a distinguished professor of biology at Macquarie University. Her research has mainly focused on the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems, and she is a founding councillor with the Climate Council of Australia, a former federal climate commissioner, and former lead author in the IPCC's 4th and 5th assessment report. And yeah, I had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Lesley Hughes speak on the last installment, the previous installment of the IPCC report. And so I think, you know, what she shared with us was so valuable then, and I'm sure it will be now. So yeah, thank you, Lesley. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Madhu and Ali, and thank you again for the Climate Justice Union for inviting me to speak to you this evening. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, well, as the host said in their introduction, what my task is today is to give you 2 short presentations covering some of the aspects of the Working Group 2 contribution to the IPCC's 6th assessment report. And thank you for those of you that were here for my last presentation. I'm glad to see you've come back for more. Just a bit of background first about what all this report is about. So the IPCC produces an assessment report about once every 7 years. So the last one came out in 2013 and 2014. That was the 5th assessment. The IPCC has 3 working groups. The first working group gives a report on the science, the basic climate science, and the most up-to-date synthesis that they can possibly manage. The second working group works on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And the third working group, whose report will, I think, be out sometime in April, works on mitigation, that is the solutions. Each of these reports is enormous. They're the most comprehensive and authoritative update on the state of our knowledge about climate change undertaken anywhere. It's a global effort. The first assessment, the Working Group 1 report of the 6th assessment was released last August, and it had enormous publicity. The second one hasn't had quite as much publicity due to a lot of other things going on, such as the Ukraine tragedy and also the flooding here locally. Though, of course, I will be drawing some connections between the flooding and with climate change. So this second report covers impacts already experienced, projected impacts for the future, the vulnerability of different sectors and different populations, the ways we can possibly adapt to those escalating impacts, and also the limits to what we will can adapt to. And I'll be talking about the adaptation side of things in the second half of this talk a bit later this evening. The report actually consists of a summary for policymakers, which is around about 40 pages. Each line of this summary is negotiated by all of the governments that are signatories to the IPCC, to the UNFCCC. And that negotiation goes line by line by line. So it's a completely time-consuming and agonising process. As well as the summary, there are detailed chapters on specific topics such as ecosystems, agriculture, etc., and also on regions. And the region, of course, of interest most to us is the Australasian region. And then there are regional fact sheets, which summarises what's going on in each region, and you can just download that fact sheet if you wish to. As I said, it's an enormous effort. This particular Working Group 2 report had over 270 convening lead authors and lead authors from 67 countries and many hundred other contributing authors. It cites over 34,000 papers and received in its various drafts over 60,000 review comments. And I should emphasise that every single one of those comments must be responded to by the authors of the particular chapter, and that those comments and the responses are available online. So it's really surely the most scrutinised set of reports ever produced by humans. As I said, the next one will be out in early April. This is Antonio Guterres. He's the head of the United Nations, the Secretary General, and he has a way with words. He described the Working Group 1 report last year as being code red for humanity, and he described Working Group 2's report released 2 weeks ago as an atlas of human suffering. Here's a quote from him. "I have seen many reports in my time, but nothing like this. Nearly half of humanity, and what he means is 3.6 billion people, is living in the danger zone now. Humanity is getting clobbered by climate change. Fossil fuels are choking humanity. Those still financing coal should be held to account. Now is the time to accelerate the transition to renewable economy." If I could use one sentence to sum up Working Group 2, it's this: it's worse than it was before. Now, nobody should really be surprised by that. I think everybody realises that the impacts of climate change are accelerating. But in this report, the current and the future impacts are significantly greater than those presented 7 years ago in the 5th assessment. It shows evidence that climate change is altering ecosystems all over the world, and I'll talk about some specific Australian ecosystems in a moment, and affecting our physical and mental health, our water security, food production, our cities and infrastructure, our economy, and basically everything. In particular, climate change is affecting our health and our security, and it lists and details the evidence for this. So, for example, mental health challenges, impacts on nutrition, vector-borne diseases. I was just reading in the Sydney Morning Herald that the first death from Japanese encephalitis has occurred in New South Wales. The changing climate is affecting the distribution of the vectors of those diseases, such as mosquitoes. It also talks about the dangers of heat stress and respiratory distress through the increased exposure, particularly to bushfire smoke. It also talks about the increases in drought, heat, flooding, bushfires, resulting in cascading impacts upon food and water resources, health and supply chains. And we are seeing that, of course, right now with the flooding in northern New South Wales and here in Sydney, where I am, and also in Queensland. There is a big emphasis in the report on how climate change is exacerbating inequality. It really does stress that climate change is a social justice issue. It particularly highlights inequalities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, urban versus rural peoples, and between generations. It highlights the fact that the very old, the very young, women in many countries, People who are already suffering from chronic diseases are those people that are most vulnerable, as well as First Nations people. Here are some key points from the Australasian chapter, which covers Australia and New Zealand and their islands. Climate change is here and now. We have had more hot days, more heat waves. We are losing snow. We're getting more rain in the northern part of Australia, less rain in the cool seasons in the southwest and the southeast, and a lot more extreme fire danger weather, especially in the southeast. Here are just a few stats that are cited in the report. So between 1987 and 2016, natural disasters, which I really wish people would stop calling them natural disasters because they're becoming increasingly unnatural disasters, caused nearly 1,000 deaths, more than 4,000 injuries, left many people homeless and affected millions. More than half of these deaths and injuries come from heat waves in cities, 22% from fires. It is still the case that extreme heat kills more people in Australia than any other extreme climate event. The costs of these disasters are enormous. So between 2007 and 2016, costs averaged $18.2 billion every single year, with floods being the most expensive. And indeed, of course, this report was written before the floods that we're witnessing now. The next on the list was cyclones, then hail, storms, and fires. Bushfires are up there as well, costing at that time, 2019 and 2020, the Black Summer, cost over $8 billion. The report highlights the fact that many of our ecosystems are already at the precipice. This, of course, includes the Great Barrier Reef that has suffered 3 major bleaching events in the past 6 years, with the loss of about 50% of the hard coral. This graph is from the report, and it just shows the intensity of the bleaching for some of those events. So we can see that the percentage of reefs with severe bleaching, for example, in 2016 and 2020, was up between 60 and 70%. Here are some of the other ecosystems that the report emphasises are at critical thresholds. So if I go from the top left and go around in the clockwise direction, our alpine ecosystems are really suffering. They're drying out, they're being burnt, and because they're getting warmer, a whole lot of vegetation that only grows in very cold climates is now losing out. Second ecosystem that we're losing is the kelp forests. We've seen a decline in southern kelp forests that provide habitat for many hundreds of other species all around the southern coasts of Australia. That middle picture is of the pencil pine forests in the World Heritage Areas in Tasmania, have been subject to incredible fires, especially at the start of 2016. Some of these trees are over 1,000 years old and they don't recover from fire. So that means that the fact that they're there means that fires have not been in those environments for well over 1,000 years, but now fires are penetrating in. And the last picture is of a jarrah forest from Western Australia, identified in the report as one of the key ecosystems. These trees are usually pretty tough, but the combinations of drought and extreme heat are affecting them. It emphasises that heat for people is deadly. The heat-related deaths in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane have increased by more than 1/3 in recent decades. And it emphasises that we can do something about this. Under a low emission scenario, we would still expect to see an increase to 300 deaths per year between 2030 and 2080 on average. But under a high emission scenario, this number would double. We know also that climate change is harming our mental health, a loss of sense of identity and place, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, and of course suicide, which is particularly prevalent in rural populations, particularly amongst male farmers during drought. And that's because climate change hurts agriculture. There's a projected decline in crop and horticulture production going forward, mainly due to extreme heat and also this decline of cool season rainfall in some of our most productive agricultural areas, for example, the Southwest Wheat Belt and the Murray-Darling Basin in the southeast. We're losing our snow cover. I wouldn't be investing in ski resorts anytime soon, with the annual maximum snow depth estimated to decrease from current levels, which is already far less than it was a few decades ago, by a further 15% by 2030, 60% by 2070, necessitating more artificial snowmaking, but of course you can only make that if the temperatures are cold enough. Climate change is, of course, as we all know, increasing fire risks with hotter and drier conditions occurring since 1950. It's been estimated that the fire season of the Black Summer was at least 30% more likely than a century ago due to the influence of climate change. Here's a map from the report showing the number of dangerous fire weather days from 1985 to 2020. And you can see that this is occurring across almost the whole of the continent. As I mentioned before, the economic costs of these unnatural disasters are enormous. There is also quite a lot of figures in the report about the costs of the loss of wealth of the country due to loss of productivity in agriculture, in manufacturing, and in service sectors. And then projected forward, and these numbers are really extraordinary, to exceed 19 billion by 2030, 211 billion by 2050, and $4 trillion by 2100 under a high emission scenario. And we are tracking just under a high emission scenario now. We know that our finance sector, that is superannuation, insurance, and our banks have very significant exposure to this climate variability and to extreme events. And we know that insured losses from these weather-related hazards are increasing and will continue to increase. So from 2013 to 2020, we're almost $15 billion or 1.2% of GDP. And of course, that's without the latest floods. And then, of course, finally, as Kabay just talked about so eloquently, climate change is having really serious impacts already on our First Nations people, especially the communities in the Torres Strait, which are particularly low-lying. The Torres Strait is experiencing sea level rise at about twice the global average. So these low-lying communities are already getting increased flood risks and increased water insecurity, with sea level rise undermining their traditional lands, including ancestral burial grounds. These impacts are unfortunately predicted to intensify in the future. I'll leave it there and pass it back to Ali and Madhu.
So what we would like to do now is just take a minute for us to jump back into their breakout rooms and share how we're feeling. I think, you know, during, like when you hear this kind of information, it's really important that you have a space to process it. So I'm hoping everyone can see my screen again. We're going to open the breakout rooms again now. And we'd like everyone to have the chance to share in those breakout rooms to make sure everyone has a chance to sort of share. We'd just like to use the question, what did you find most interesting so far, as a sort of guiding question for your discussion. Just a couple of ground rules about going into spaces like this. You know, it's good to validate each other's responses. There is no right or wrong response, and we shouldn't devalue each other's responses. But I'd also urge everyone to be compassionate and to treat each other kindly while we're in there. So I'll get Luke to open those rooms again, and we've got about 7 minutes for that.
All right then, I think we'll call everyone in now. I hope you had a refreshing couple of minutes. I'd like to welcome Lesley back to continue with her presentation.
Thank you. I'm now going to talk about the sort of second theme of the report, which is adaptation. Most of what I say is from the report, but I'm going to throw in a few other things as well. And that's because the IPCC is very strict that their reports are not meant to be policy prescriptive. They basically synthesize and supply the information to underpin good policy, but it's not their role to tell governments what to do or people what to do. But because I wanted to say a few things in this talk about what I think we should do, I'm going to mix up some of my own views and those of my colleagues with some of the IPCC report. So, but getting back to the IPCC report, one of the things that the Australasian chapter emphasised is that climate change may well overwhelm our institutions and our government systems. And I think anybody looking at what's happening in the floods in New South Wales and Queensland will be seeing that on the news every night. Clearly, our emergency services, our governments, our army, our politicians are being overwhelmed with the scale of this catastrophe. So because climate impacts are accelerating, they are also cascading to other sectors. So something that might start off affecting one sector cascades to another, impacts on agriculture cascade to mental health, for example. And then they're also compounding. So for example, there are many communities now being flooded that a couple of years ago were burnt in the Black Summer bushfires. They still weren't really fully recovered from the bushfires, and now they've got this other catastrophe. So that is what is meant by compounding impacts, impact upon impact upon impact. So one of the things that the IPCC report, of course, doesn't say, but is a key message from the Climate Council, is that we need stronger action now, and we will be measuring stronger action in lives and livelihoods and species saved. And I gave a stat previously on the difference between a low and a high emissions scenario for heat-related deaths. So adaptation, one of the messages of the report is that there are hard limits to what we can adapt to. We can't just be complacent to say, well, whatever nature throws at us, we are going to be able to keep adapting because that's what humans do. Humans are, of course, an incredibly adaptable species, the most adaptable that's ever evolved, but there are limits. So the risks are escalating with every fraction of a degree of warming. The ability for us to adapt will fundamentally depend on emissions reductions, especially over the next decade. But in some natural and human systems, there are irreversible impacts likely occurring. There are many, many challenges for adaptation. Here are some of them that are included in the report. There are so many complex connections between these compounding impacts that there are new types of risks being generated that we've never seen before when some of these disasters happen in quick succession. These exacerbate existing stresses on our communities, and they constrain further adaptation options. The report does note that in Australia, the ambition, the scope and the progress in adaptation has increased since the last assessment, mostly at the state and particularly at local government levels, but also within non-government organisations, within businesses and within communities. Now, it is noteworthy that Australia still does not have a national climate change adaptation strategy that embraces all levels of government. People have been calling for this for decades, and we do not have one. Adaptation progress is uneven. There are lots of gaps, there are lots of barriers, there are limits, there is a deficit in adaptive capacity in many sectors. And it's also hampered by the legacies of past institutional practices. So for example, in the past where local governments might have allowed floodplain development, we now are facing the legacies of those past practices. Now, this statistic is not in the report, but it comes from a Productivity Commission report published a few years ago. And it's a statistic that is being bandied about in the media right now for obvious reasons. 3% of our so-called natural disaster budget is spent on preparing and mitigating. 97% is spent cleaning up the mess afterwards and rebuilding. You will hear this statistic and these sort of principles talked about a lot at the moment. We clean up after the flood. We don't prepare very well for the flood in the first place, even though we know in places like Lismore, it is going to happen again. Some more challenges for adaptation. Adaptation progress, and this is all from the report, is being hampered by a lot of different urban redevelopment practices, statutory planning guidelines, and they particularly highlight the ongoing removal of green space in our cities and regional centres. They call for a greater shift from reactive to proactive adaptation. At the moment, as I said, we're good at cleaning up. We're not so good at preparing in the first place. The report calls for step change that's needed to match the accelerating risks and support, and this is a new phrase for the IPCC and it appears throughout the report, climate resilient development. That is, it acknowledges that development will still occur, but it should be done in a way that makes infrastructure, communities, anything as climate resilient as possible. What has been clear both at the moment in the media and over the past few decades is the developing tensions between managed relocation, for example, and personal values. So for example, there have been some pretty famous court cases done in coastal inundation locations where people wanted permission to build seawalls to protect their own property, even though the building of a seawall might make erosion of neighbouring properties a bigger problem. So these tensions between what we might need to do at a community level and what individuals might want to do to protect their own lives and property are becoming much, much greater. Of course, there has been a lot in the media the last few days about whether people should we move towns? And if so, who is going to pay for that? There are also tensions between goals of adaptation and goals of mitigation or emissions reduction. Some of the ways in which we try to reduce emissions might be bad for adaptation and vice versa. But it also stresses that in some cases there are win-win situations, co-benefits from a single adaptation strategy that will also reduce emissions. Here's one example that I often give for my own students. So this is an infrared picture of a park in Western Sydney on a day that was 35.3 degrees. These people are sitting under the shade, and what you can see is that they are sitting in temperature of 21 degrees. That's the blue colour. So just putting in more greenery in an urban environment can have an extraordinary impact on the comfort level on an extremely hot day. That is one example of a win-win situation because, of course, putting more greenery in an environment can reduce energy costs from air conditioning and also provide habitat for biodiversity. It's really a win-win-win. So greening our cities is identified in the Australasian section of the report as something that's absolutely critical in terms of our adaptation to extreme heat in particular. But as I said, it also has emissions reduction benefits because every one of those plants is fixing carbon. It has amenity and mental health benefits as well as habitat benefits. The report also notes that the new buzz term of nature-based solutions really needs to take off. So nature-based solutions are where we do things that are good for nature that are also good for people. And I've just got some examples here. So replanting mangroves gives coastal protection. Some of my colleagues are working on a project called Living Seawalls. So the top right-hand picture is a seawall in Sydney. And of course, we're going to need more and more of these seawalls. But instead of just putting in concrete blocks, these seawalls have had panels put in to encourage marine organisms to live and settle. And they've just been a finalist in the International Earthshot Prize and have just won a big contract to put these living seawalls into various developments in Dubai and elsewhere around the world. The bottom left-hand picture is of an oyster reef. That is all of those oyster shells that after we've taken the oysters out, the oysters tend to get thrown out. But if gathered together, they can be used to make reefs of their own, once again, both protecting coastal environments and providing habitat for species. So nature-based solutions is really emphasised in this report as a way in which we can fix a whole lot of different problems all at the same time. So this is a message not from the IPCC, though of course it's implicit in the report. It's certainly a message from the Climate Council. There is still so much we can and must fight for. We can't give up. We can't just say it's really bad, there's no hope, we're all just going to get under the doona. We actually have to fight and keep fighting. Our future, and particularly our children's and grandchildren's futures, depend on much stronger action this decade. It's what we do between now and 2030 that really counts. Kicking the can down the road and saying we're going to focus on net zero in 2050 misses the boat completely. We will have a very, very dangerous planet indeed, unless we at least halve emissions by 2030. So it's our near-term actions that count. We will almost certainly go over 1.5 degrees by about 2030, but we've got to work very hard not to overshoot by too much, and certainly to try to keep global warming to less than 2 degrees. Unfortunately, we know at the moment that even the increased levels of ambition shown at the Glasgow COP, even if implemented 100% and on time, will get us to 2.4 degrees, which is double the amount of warming of 1.2 degrees that we've had so far. And that would be by the second half of this century. So imagine if we got double the number of severe bushfires, or they were double in size, double the frequency of floods like we're seeing now. That future is really unimaginable, and it's something we must work very, very hard to avoid. We cannot avoid, however, all the risks that we are going to face in the next few decades. We've got to get smarter at adapting and preparing for them, but we've got to work very hard so they don't get any worse. And I'll leave it there. I would encourage anybody that hasn't been to the Climate Council website. We are just about to release a floods report. I think that's being launched tomorrow. And there's lots of information about pretty much anything you want to know about climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lesley. And I just wanted to reflect on what we just heard and just acknowledge how much work you've done to really bring this down to how this will affect us and how this will affect our communities in a really tangible and clear way. And I think, yeah, that's a real testament to your work. And it also leads us to sort of something I really wanted to touch on really quickly, is that, you know, climate change is not just an environmental issue. It is also a human issue. And in fact, it's this false dichotomy between, you know, human beings over here and then the environment and nature over there, that is quickly becoming clear that that just isn't true. You know, it's all related. And, you know, the importance of centering people's lived experience of these issues, people and communities on the front line, you know, such as Kabay acknowledging his piece as well, again, is just as important as the science, or the Western science, I should say, because there are lots of different ways of knowing and producing knowledge around the world. And yeah, how we deal with this stuff is really going to depend on whether or not the actions we take is are going to be equitable and are going to look after people and are going to materially improve the lives of people and address the inequities that are, you know, causing these crises to begin with. And again, it's I also wanted to flag that this isn't just an inevitable result of humans existing. You know, this is this crisis is caused by unfair and undemocratic systems, and which determine, you know, who gets access to resources and who has power to influence decisions being made and who gets to make those decisions. And so these systems are the same systems that decide, you know, who is able to be housed, who is able to be a citizen of a nation state, who is able to access healthcare, you know, so all of those things are interconnected. And so grateful to our speakers so far for allowing us to reflect on this together. And now I'll hand you over to Luke, who's going to take you through the next piece.
All right, Ale, do you want to flick to the next slide? Yeah, so I'm just introducing Jasmine, who's not actually here with us today, but who's created a video for us. Actually, if you were on the IPCC workshops that we did last year, you might have seen this video before. She created for us to use for all of these IPCC workshops. Jasmine is a clinical psychologist who divides her time between private practice and academia, and as Ale mentioned before, was an official reviewer for the Working Group 2 Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability report, obviously with a particular focus on the mental health side of things. And as you can see there, it says she's been working with children and adolescents in a therapeutic environment for 10 years and predominantly works to support families in a systematic kind of a way. She also teaches undergraduate psychology and conducts research in emotion theory and group processes. And she's one of our key volunteers and member leaders at Climate Justice Union. I think Jasmine will probably give an overview of her own work in the video. So do you want to move on to that? And Ale just might need to make sure that you're sharing audio as well. Might need to give it a moment to load.
Hi everybody, my name's Jasmine. I'm a psychologist and I'm also involved in climate psychology research. Now I understand that you've been listening to a lot of information that's been released in the most recent IPCC report, and it's really important that we pause to reflect here about what we've been listening to and its impact on us and what's actually going on inside of us. Sometimes we can be listening and thinking about these things and really using our brains, especially when we're trying to understand a lot of intellectual information, like what comes up with the climate science. But a part of this can also be involving our imagination around how do we fit in with this information? How is this going to impact us and our world? What will our world look like? What will our local community look like as we're listening to these this information? So there's a lot of really rich internal experiences that we might be at risk of missing or not attuning to if we don't pause and reflect on what's going on. Now there's going to be a wide range of internal experiences from listening to this information from this group, because it's very personal and very present for everyone's individual contexts. So we're going to have some parents in this space who might be thinking about their children and how does my child fit into this? How does this impact my child? We're going to have some young people who are aware of their own lives and what decisions are they going to make and how does this impact their future and what's this going to look like for them. There might be people who are working in industries that might be facing large scale change, and what does this look like for job security or for what they've sort of worked their entire life towards? What does this mean for them? There might be people who are already vulnerable in society. So there's a whole range of contexts that will be present listening to this information. Now, when we talk about climate-related emotions, we can often think of eco-anxiety, but there's a whole range of different experiences that people have when it comes to listening to or being aware of climate change and its impact on our societies. So we have anxiety, which is this sense of there's a lot of change coming. It comes with many unknowns. This is really difficult to be unaware of exactly what that means for us, or a bit scary of what this information might mean for our future and for the people that we love. Some people have a sense of depression of this is all too much, this is really sad, and there can be some grief within this as well, of this expected losses of life and biodiversity and how we operate as societies, that things are going to change, and with that comes some grief. Some people might be sitting with a sense of anger of, okay, well, we're hearing all this important information, and who's doing something about it? Is there enough being done? The sense of maybe even being let down, like, I wish that we weren't in this position right now, that I wish someone had done something about this earlier. And some fear as well. There's another word that's been created to explain this sense of being homesick while still at home. It's called solastalgia, and it's this sense of I'm aware of the world around me, and the place that I'm in is going to be changing and looking drastically different, and that's quite painful. Or if we are in places like beaches or landscapes that are looking already very different, there's that sense of grief of the things that I love, although I still have them, are very different to what they once were. Now, emotions, although they can be quite potent and quite powerful, and in some cases quite overwhelming, emotions indicate that there's something that we need. So we don't need to be too overwhelmed or scared of experiencing these things, but curious about what is this saying to me about what I need, and what sort of person I am, and what I can do in this space. So people who are feeling angry might have a sense of, I need justice and I need to be heard, and they can work towards just and fair outcomes. They could look at lobbying, advocacy, those sorts of things. People who are feeling sadness or grief, then that sense of loss of connections, loss of community, loss of the spaces that they're in. What can be really useful for these people is they need that connection. There's a sense of loss, and reconnecting with their communities, reconnecting with environments, and working in spaces that are actively looking to reconnect different places, people and spaces can be really helpful in those times. And then people who feel anxious, there's this sense of uncertainty, this unsettled feeling about what is to come, and I need to understand what's to come. I need to know how to protect the people who I love and myself and my places. And they can work on providing clear information and planning and mitigation and these sorts of things. So these emotions, as powerful as they can be, there are actually things that we can do, and we can learn more about ourselves when we pause and reflect on what's actually coming up for us. Now, these emotions, I've sort of simplified them in a sense, but it can be a mix of a few different things, and it can also be a mix of a few different contexts. We're sort of talking about IPCC report and what this means for the future, but people can be experiencing natural disasters and have a whole range of emotions come up around those, and we can be aware of the impact of intersectionality on these different issues, or consecutive events, like, for instance, we're currently going through pandemic and we're having our own emotions that are coming up because of the different experiences we're having. Plus, we're then hearing IPCC information as well. So it all comes with this added complexity. Now, I have been part of a research group that released some information, released a comprehensive literature review earlier this year that looked at a whole range of different types of crises that human beings experience that is beyond climate change. So trying to get a sense of what happens for humans as we go through crises, what comes up, and what can we do through these crises to support good mental health. So the types of crises that were looked at were financial crisis, medical crisis like cancer diagnoses, natural disasters, there was some terrorism, civil war, pandemics, so a huge range of different crises that we go through. And there were three themes that were present. No matter the type of crisis, there were three themes that indicated what was important for our experience of these and how we support good mental health through these. So the three different themes were, the first one was around emotions and how emotions were really important and really present throughout all the different crises, and that it was really important for people to have someone to validate those emotional responses and to listen and to explore with them what was happening around those emotional responses, that in order to support good mental health, being aware of how we're feeling about things and understanding how to process that was really important. The second theme was that collective approaches to supporting mental health was really important. So it wasn't as simple as saying to people, okay, focus on self-care, and that's really important, but we also needed the individual support. So sometimes we see that as what the work that psychologists can do, individual support, but families needed to be supported as well. And smaller communities like school communities or minority communities needed to be supported, and greater communities needed to be supported as well. And on top of that, there also needed to be good legislation. So legislative and institutional support to create policies that can protect the communities and protect the mental health through this. And it wasn't down to just one of these being present. There actually needed to be a synthesis of the different levels of support available to support people's mental health through these crises. And then the third theme was that accurate and reliable communication was really important, that people needed to receive information about what was to come and what that meant for them as individuals, what that meant for them as local communities, scaffold what that would be like for them, scaffold the different expectations that they could have about what was coming, and also scaffold the types of responses that would be really useful. So it also needed to be very place-based. So different local communities or different families needed to have responses that were useful for their particular context. So this is three different themes: attending to emotions, collective support of mental health, and also accurate and reliable communication were all really important for supporting mental health. So that's something that we're sort of doing here. We're providing the IPCC report and communicating it in a clear and relatable way and explaining, and also making space to talk about the emotional impact of hearing these things. So I understand that we're going to be breaking into breakout groups to process some of these. So I will finish off there and sort of virtually hand over to Luke to continue.
Virtually, thank you, Jasmine.
Hi.
So we have an interesting, maybe Ale, you want to stop sharing your screen and restart your screen share. It's coming across very bad. But what we are going to do now is we are going to have people go into breakout rooms for, oh, here comes the video, but we'll go in for, how much time have we got? Is it around 8 minutes again? Yeah, so for about 8 minutes, there'll be an opportunity for you to actually share your emotional responses to what you've heard so far. So earlier we talked about what was really interesting, you know, in the first part of Lesley's presentation, and then you had your breakout to, you know, kind of digest some of that and talk with each other about what was interesting. So this is really about giving you that opportunity to address your emotions. But I want to be very clear. You can see the questions on the page there. But the most important thing about this is that it's not a therapeutic space. None of us, well, maybe one or two of us is, but most of us are not psychologists. Please only share what you feel comfortable with sharing with other people. And please really do refrain from trying to give advice to other people or trying to take on a caring role for other people, and respect each other's confidentiality. So this is a space where, you know, we're holding space for each other and we're acknowledging what each other is saying and feeling, but we're not trying to solve problems for each other. After this, and it's already been posted once, but after this, we'll provide a resource sheet in the chat that you can find links to mental health services and information if you feel that you need extra support. So I'm going to put everyone into some breakout rooms now, and you'll get a chance to have a talk about what is it like for you to hear about impacts, vulnerability, and what we need to do. What sort of emotions come up for you when you think of the future? And what are some things that you can do now to connect with your community or with nature? Acknowledging that we've had a few people drop off, we might need to readjust some of the breakout rooms, but you should be getting an invite now, and we might reassign some people around after people join to make sure all the rooms are full and nobody's alone. All right, looks like everyone's back now. Hopefully you all found that a useful and supportive bit of time. We're not going to really have a opportunity to, you know, share in this main group what everyone thought and felt. But we did want to take a moment to wrap this piece up properly, so you haven't just had, you know, what is a important mental health conversation and then just been left moving on to the next piece. So what's really important for us to share is that your responses are all valid. You know, as Jasmine pointed out in her video, there are many, many, many different contexts that we are all living through, and our background context determines how we're feeling and how we're responding to whatever's going on in our life at the time, including to how we deal with information like what we've received today, and how we deal with, you know, things like government inaction in the face of what is an existential crisis, right? So we wanted to point out that there's a bunch of common responses that we know are out there and name them, you know. So it's normal to feel anxiety. It can be normal to feel depression or anger or fear and uncertainty about what's coming on, or that sense of solastalgia that Jasmine was talking about, you know, a kind of longing for a future that may not happen, or, you know, a future that's going to be different, that we would want to be how it is now for us, for, you know, our children or for other generations, or even for ourselves in the future. But we recognize that that might not happen. So it's that sense of, you know, homesickness and missing something that might actually still be here right now, but knowing that it's going to be lost. I feel this personally a little bit when I deal with the fact that the northern jarrah forests here in Western Australia are predicted, even under a low emission scenario, with a 95% certainty to be lost. And, you know, they're communities that I've fought for. And so I have a feeling of that solastalgia and grief around that potential loss that hasn't happened yet. It's also important to understand that we can't ignore the reality we live in, but we can look after ourselves and each other through it, you know? So that means taking part in moments like this where you actually share your emotions with other people. And it also means, like, you know, not just in the space of when we're hanging out with other people from the climate movement. There are so many people in your life who you might not realize are going through these emotions in response to this same information. And you can play a role in supporting those people by having conversations with them, sharing what you know and what you feel, and giving them some of those things that we know they need around accurate information, and, you know, groups of people and collective actions that they can take and be a part of, and space to share those emotions. So I think that's everything that I'm going to say in wrapping up that piece.
Thanks, Luke. Everyone can still see my screen, right? I think. But in any case, we're going to just share those links again from earlier from Our Islands, Our Home campaign joint statement into the chat. So anyone who hasn't had a chance to do those, just wanted to make sure that everyone knows that there is an online option. So I know that during the pandemic, it's going to be difficult for some people to leave the house. There's a whole, there's flooding, there's a whole host of reasons. There is still a way to get that joint statement in front of your MP's eyes by clicking on the email action there and sharing that with everyone you know as well. There was about 100 people on the call tonight. So if everyone on the call signs up to do that at least, and then also potentially comes to a real life action and brings a few other people, then that's actually quite a lot of action that we've gotten just out of this little meeting tonight. I know that, my response emotionally, I think, to a lot of this stuff is rage. I feel this like overwhelming sense of anger at what happens. But I think one of the most beautiful things that I've encountered in my time as an activist is solidarity and people who are willing to step up for you and doing the same for them as well. And I think that's what the people in the Torres Strait really need from us right now is to show solidarity and take that issue and make it a big election issue. And of course, something that's obvious is that it's not just going to be in the Torres Strait where people are feeling these effects right now. I'm surrounded by floods living in Sydney. It's a bit of a time happening at the moment. So there's really nowhere to go, unfortunately. And so I think the thing is that we have to find ways to keep supporting each other through these and stick together. So, just to reiterate that, it's up to us to make that change happen. I think what we're very aware of with our current governments around the world is that it's going to be up to us to force them to do the right thing. We do have the agency to make change. And as Lesley said earlier, the like measurements of fractions of a degree are going to be measured in lives and ecosystems and animals lost, animal species lost. And every kilogram of carbon that we can keep in the ground matters. Every life is worth fighting for. And what we really need here is systemic change. Individual actions are not going to be enough in the sense that, individual consumer choices, recycling, walking more, these are all great things, reducing your own fossil fuel consumption. These are all good things to do, but they're not going to be adequate to the change that we need. And we also know that 100 companies are causing 70% of climate change pollution. So, I'd really encourage everyone to not beat yourself up too much about trying to, save energy and stuff like that, even though it's a good thing to do. But what we really need to do is act collectively. And I feel like on some level, I know a bunch of people on this call are already doing a lot of activism and have a lot of experience. So I'd just like to acknowledge that as well in the same breath that I'm saying that we need to take action collectively. What we need is to change our entire economic system and social system into one that actually looks after people. So not just in terms of moving from a carbon and fossil fuel based economy into a renewable one, but also doing that in a way that actually looks after people and is democratic and transfers that wealth and that power back to ordinary people. Governments, financial institutions, workers, community members, we can work together to force that change on those big companies. And I think, for a lot of people, we might think, thank you, Gregory. I think a lot of us might think, oh, I don't know if I can do anything. I don't know if I'm a leader or if I can get other people to change their minds. But as Luke said earlier, there's going to be a lot of people out there who are not already part of the climate movement, who are hearing this information. We know that a lot more people now believe in climate change and believe that we need action on it than did, a couple of decades ago. And, those people are going to need people like us who are already in the movement and already dealing with these issues to reach out to them. So I would encourage you to do the actions that we've done tonight, to get involved with people around you and try and bring those people into the movement so we can step up together and take on this challenge, because we really have, there's no choice, right? We really have to stick together and try and build our movement even further. And I just wanted to say as well, I think a lot of the time in the climate movement, we feel that we're not getting anywhere. You know, like we look at the political landscape and we feel this sense of like frustration and despair, and like all of the work that I'm doing, like it doesn't get anywhere. But I just, you know, in those moments, I like to think about, you know, how 20 years ago, you basically couldn't talk about climate change in public and get any kind of serious reaction. Now we're at a point where I'd say that narrative question has absolutely been won. And then the question is, how do we make the political change and enforce change on corporations that are polluting the planet, and make that change happen? So yeah, like it makes me feel so warm to see all the people who've come along tonight. I hope you found this useful. I'm just going to pass over to Madhu to wrap up a little bit, and then we will let everyone get back to your evenings. I realize that it's been a long haul tonight, but we've been doing great with time. So Madhu, I'll just hand over to you, and yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ale. So just to wrap up the stuff that we've heard. So, you know, what do people need during a crisis? It's, you know, spaces and community to, you know, validate their emotions, so that they can exist as they are and collect and get that collective support, and collective supporting each other to take collective action, and of course accurate and reliable information, and you know, I think truth telling is also a big part of that. So the people around us, they need to know that, you know, they have friends, family members and colleagues they can turn to for information and support, and someone to listen to their feelings and their experiences. And so as people who care, who are working in this space, who are activists, organizers, advocates, you know, it's let's take on that role. Let's uphold that responsibility, and do what we can to hold this space for the people around us. And so what does that look like? Like, what does contributing to this movement look like? And, you know, if you're unsure how to do this, if you're unsure what taking action means, you know, you are not alone, and you're not starting from nothing. You know, there are community groups, organizations, unions, all who are doing this work, and people who have been doing this work in some shape or form for generations. And so we always acknowledge the work that has come before us, and that means, you know, we can look to wisdom from those who have been doing this work longer than us, and we can join existing communities who are doing this work, who can hold us in that space as well. So that can look like your workplace, your industry, so your union probably comes in there as well, your local community, you know, even if you're in a local community choir, or your men's shed, or a knitting group. I don't know, that I know knitting became very big in the pandemic, so I thought that was worth a shout out. Your family, your friends, cultural groups, religious groups, you know, these are all places where community exists, and we can use those relationships to build collective change. And that's how we build power. So Ale, did you want to wrap up the last piece, and, you know, with the actions that we need to take?
Thanks, Madhu. I think basically that's everything that we had for you tonight. I think if we can just get those links shared once more in the chat, you know, in addition to signing up, if everyone here can just pass those on to a couple of other people and get them involved, that would be great. Everyone who's signed up to the in-person action, we will phone you and try and connect you to an action that's happening, or try and work with you to get an action happening in your area. And everyone who signs up to do the email action will get information sent to them as well. Yeah, just like to remind everyone as well that the Climate Justice Union, who's been working with 350 on this and providing a lot of expertise in terms of mental health and leading on building this this workshop, and the ones we've done previously together, has done a lot of work. So if you can, I would thoroughly recommend checking their website out and joining the Climate Justice Union if you can. I'd just like to say thanks again to everyone who's been helping out on the tech tonight, in the chat, and yeah, and to Luke for running the mental health section, for Madhu for co-hosting with me tonight. And I think that's just about everything we need to say. Just so everyone knows, just to reiterate, we will be sending around the recording of this to everyone who RSVP'd for tonight's action. And then we will also be sending an email with some mental health resources that we linked earlier, with the links for the Our Islands, Our Home joint statement delivery, and links to join the Climate Justice Union as well. So that'd be great. If you found this useful, there's going to be another report happening coming out this month. We'll be doing another one of these workshops. So if you found this useful, you know anyone else who you think would find it useful, keep an eye out for that email. And yeah, I think with that we can wrap it up. So we're just going to let everyone have a chance to just jump into your breakout rooms again. If you're tired and you want to go to dinner or whatever, feel free to jump off. If you want to jump back in there and just connect with those people or debrief with them and have a chat, then that's an option that's available as well. And yeah, other than that, yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you during the campaigns.
And thank you, Ale, for all of the work that you and the 350 crew have put into making this happen as well. So I'm going to open those breakout rooms for people. I don't know how many people are going to be in them. We won't be doing any reassigning. This is just an opportunity that if you were in a breakout room with someone and your conversation got cut short and you want to go back to it, they may or may not be in there. So I'll open those up for you now, and good luck. Thanks, everyone.